Hey guys, welcome back to Mr. News Art class. It's wonderful to see your smiling faces. This lesson is a continuation of our theme on landscapes and creating a three-dimensional distance on a flat sheet of paper. In last week's video, we talked about a river going through some dark woods at night and the moonlight reflecting down off the water. And in today's lesson, we're going to go for a much drier scene. We're going to go for a desert. There's going to be lots of sand and rocks, maybe some cacti. It's going to be great. Let's get started. Now for today's landscape, all you're going to need is a pencil or two and maybe a handheld sharpener to sharpen things with, maybe an extra eraser or two. We're going to be focusing mostly today on shading and how that's going to help to create some three-dimensional depth by the way light shines and creates shadows. So on our paper, of course horizontal because we're drawing a landscape, we're going to start with the horizon like we always do, so straight across the middle. And you want to do this kind of lightly so that you can erase things. I've got to do it dark enough that the camera can see what I'm doing. So my lines probably won't erase as well, but you want to do it lightly so that you can erase lines. Okay, so for starters, we have that horizon. Coming down from the horizon on both sides, we're going to have canyon walls, like we're in the middle of a canyon or looking towards the middle of a canyon. And so to do that, we're going to have kind of on both sides, lines that drop from the horizon to the bottom in sort of a zigzag is the wrong word. Jagged is what we're looking for. Here's what I don't want. I don't want zigzag, 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 where the zigs and zags are like close to the same. I don't want that. I want a jagged, rocky, bumpy line. Like this is the edge of a cliff. So you can think of this shape here on the left as being like the ground that you could stand on and walk on. And then if you got to here, you jump, whee, and you fall into the middle of the canyon. We want the same thing on this side, but we don't want it to be like exactly the same. We want it to have its own rocky, bumpy, jagged shape to it, okay? Now, so these two sides are where you could be like standing, standing, walking, 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 jump, weep, and you fall, and in the middle is the space in the middle of the canyon. Right now, it does not have a three-dimensional feel because we're only seeing the top surface. To get the three-dimensional feel, we need to have more than one surface showing, right? So like if I was drawing a cube, the top of that cube might look like a rhombus-y shape, and then there would be like another side of the cube here, and then like another side of the cube here, and now it looks three-dimensional because it's got the different, we're seeing more than one side of it. And then it would look even more three-dimensional if we added shading to it, but we'll talk about shading in a bit. Here, we're going to see the top surface, and then we're also going to see sort of the inside of the canyon wall as it goes down. To do that, we want to pick corners of our jagged line that point towards the middle, okay? Like this corner, you see that points to the middle. Not so much this one, that points towards the outside, but this corner here points that way. Right? So from a corner like this, a corner that points towards the middle, from there, we're going to drop down with a bumpy line coming down. Right now, it's not quite doing it for me, but if we do that for all of these edges, right? Here's an edge, drop it down. Here's a corner, drop it down. Again, we want them bumpy, rocky lines, drop it down. Here, drop it down, but when we bump into something, we stop. This is overlapping, right? When we bump into the edge of the cliff, we stop here. We don't want to keep going through it. Bumpy, rocky cliff edges coming down. bumpy, rocky cliff edges. And they don't have to be straight. Like, see how this one kind of curves under? That's totally up to you if you want to have them doing that. Right? This one's going to be little. Okay. It's sort of, if you're thinking about it the right way at this point, it's sort of starting to look three-dimensional, where this is the top, and then all of these shapes are sort of vertical. So like this shape is the top, and then these shapes are the side, right? The inside of the canyon. Let's do the same thing on this side. Any of our points that point in, from here we drop down, 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 we drop down, we drop down. From here we drop down until we bump into the cliff edge, and then we stop. See how that's like an edge that goes behind, right? It's rock cliff edges jutting out in different angles. And there we go. And then at the top here where it hits the horizon, we want to kind of keep that jaggedness going across. We don't want that straight, smooth horizon there. Okay, so again on this side, let's wrap that jaggedness across and then erase that bit of the horizon. Okay. And from this point, it's time to start considering shading. In order to start considering shading, we need to start considering where the light is shining from. I'm going to plop the sun sort of low in the sky, right in the middle. That's going to help give us a direction for where the light is shining. Now, if the light is shining down from behind everything, then the sides of objects that are close to me are going to be in shadow. It's going to be backlit. So these faces of the cliff are going to be varying degrees of shadow. Let's take a look at this edge right here. Right? This edge juts out into the canyon quite a bit. So it's going to be in a little bit of shadow, but there's going to be a lot of reflected light that shines onto it, right? So let's shade this whole shape from here down with sort of a number 1 value, maybe a number 2. If you don't remember the value scale that we talked about previously, the value scale running from this was many weeks ago. The value scale running from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, where 0 is paper white and 4 is as dark as you can get it. That's what we're talking about when we say 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. 2 is right in the middle, 4 is super dark, 0 is nothing at all, right? So this is light. It's like a number 1. It's more than just paper white, but it's not much more. Right? Then, as we work into overlapping shadows, they're going to get darker. So this shadow is going to be darker because not only is it, so this is like a number 2 value here. So not only is it in shadow because the light is shining from behind, but also it's catching the shadow from this cliff onto it. So it's like way dark, right? Or at least darker than the first one, okay? And then this area is going to be even darker than that because it's catching the shadow of 2 of these edges onto it, as well as it's backlit. So this edge here is going to be even darker, kind of like a number 3 maybe, or 2.5, right? It's going to be, we're getting progressively darker with our shadows as we move into smaller nooks and crannies, right? And then this next area is going to be even darker, and I'm just pushing down even harder with my pencil, holding it closer to the tip and pushing even harder. until at this last point, it's like, I'm just going to be pushing all the way, right? For these last little shadowed areas here, it's just going to be like let's just push just as dark as we can get it, right? And by creating these different values, it's already starting to make this feel much, much more three-dimensional. This top surface is the lightest because the light is still kind of shining down on it. The sunlight is still shining down a little bit on it. So that is, you know, the top surface is the lightest surface. And then you've got varying degrees of shadow going on. Now, I shouldn't have sharpened my pencil quite so sharp. It's hard to shade in large areas with a dark value like this if your pencil is super sharp, and my pencil is like super ultra pointy sharp. So it's almost like I'm just scratching up the paper instead of applying any value here. But you get the idea. And right, so this area would be super dark as well, just where I've got these darkest shadows. Now, I've got this next little layer here where I've got to reconsider where am I starting here? I want it to be darker than that area. So it's going to be like this one, right? So how did I get that? I was, sideways pencil shading like this. Also consider that there's more distance between this, this edge of the cliff here and that one way back there. So there's not going to be as much of a shadow cast from there. But it's also still backlit. So there still is going to be shadow there, but it's not going to be as much, right? And then we work our way darker, darker, darker into these little nooks and crannies. And in this particular case, I'm just going to make these two shadows are going to merge into one shape. These two areas are going to merge into one shape because that whole area is just so dark. You wouldn't be able to see that it's two separate shapes. You wouldn't be able to see that it's two separate surfaces. It's just all dark. It's all shadow. Okay. So once you've shaded all these different layers, all these different levels, we'll move on to the next sort of surface that needs to be added into, or depth that needs to be added into our picture. I'm just going to shade this one side so that we can see the difference, shaded and not shaded, right? So we're going to have one side of our picture shaded, or at least I am going to have one side of my picture shaded and one side just drawn outlines without shading, so that we can see in the end how big of an impact that shading really has on the end product. All right. So we've got the sort of foreground area where we've got the cliffs. We're going to add some cacti to that later, but not yet. We want to sort of move into the middle ground. So in this area inside the canyon, or sort of beyond the canyon, this is almost like the edge of a canyon where we're looking out past it. Anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to draw a couple of hills. I'm just going to draw two curves, showing there's two hills here, and then, so it's like hill, second hill, and then just off into the distance, right? Now these two hills are like really big hills. There would probably be sand dunes across the rest of the desert, but this area here is just so far away where we wouldn't see that stuff. Now, I'm going to have a road that goes over these hills, and it's going to come to a vanishing point on the horizon directly underneath the sun. And so what I want to do is I'm going to come from that vanishing point, and I want my road to, I don't want it to be straight. I want it to like curve as it goes up and over these hills. So from this vanishing point, I'm going to kind of curve it to one side. And I've got both my lines coming from the vanishing point. And notice how close together they are, right? They are literally touching here. They cross each other here at the vanishing point. They don't get very far apart because this is still super far away. This is part of the background or distant middle ground. This is very far away. So that road is going to appear very narrow. Then it disappears behind the hill, and it travels even more distance while it is behind the hill. Then when it comes up over the hill, it's going to be closer to us, so it's going to appear wider. So I've got to figure out where on this hill is it going to come up and crest over the top of the hill. And so maybe I'll have it doing that from this side. And where it does, it needs to be wider than it was when it disappeared behind the hill. So it was really narrow there. I've like doubled how wide it is here. All right. And something like that. Again, notice how it is wider at the bottom than it is at the top. If I measure that, how wide is it at where it comes up over that hill? Compare it to how wide is it where it disappears behind the next hill. See, it's getting bigger as it comes close to us, right? These lines are getting farther apart from each other as it comes close to us. And then the same thing here. It needs to be wider than this where it crests over the top of this hill. And something like that. Now, at this point, it's kind of looking hillish and kind of looking roadish, but what's really going to make it look like a road is if we put those dash lines down the middle of the road. So right here in the part that's close to us, I'm going to start with some nice rectangles for that dash line down the middle of the road. There's nice biggish, right? Biggish rectangles. We can actually see each individual dash mark, right, at this point. And we can see them big enough that it's not just a little line. It's like, you know, it's got some thickness to it. At this point, they're going to appear much smaller, right? Maybe it'll still have a little bit of thickness. And this might be where you would need a really sharp pencil to get really tiny little rectangles in here. Or they might even disappear into just lines. Okay, notice the size difference between how big those rectangles are here versus how big they are there, how small they are there. Okay, then here, it's like, it's just gonna appear like dots if you can even see it, right? And it just disappears. The dash line in the middle is like, if you can even see it. It's just so far away. You know, you can't even make out the line when the road is that far away, right? Now it looks a lot more like there's actually a road going over some hills and then off into the distance. Shadows. How are we going to handle shadows? Well, again, I'm only going to do shadows on one half. So, I mean, I could even like draw a line down the middle and say I'm going to have shadows on this half and not have shadows on this half. Well, the answer is the way these hills curve is different from the way these just jut out, right? So these are going to have the light, you know, the light is still kind of coming down from above. So the top edge of these hills is going to be very lightly shaded because it's, you know, it's kind of, the hill has kind of turned towards us, but it's still enough of that surface upwards that it's getting some of that light from the sun, right? So it's going to be what we call a gradient. I'm shading lightly up here, but I'm going to progressively get that shading darker as I move down. And I don't want it to be like blocky, where it's like light and then medium and then dark. I want it to transition smoothly from light to medium to dark. And it doesn't need to get like super dark because it's not like there's It's not like there's major shadows going on here. There's going to be a lot of ambient reflected light at this point. But it is going to be darker at the bottom of that hill than it is moving up the hill. Okay. So something kind of like that, and then I would need to, of course, make the road darker because it's a road, right? The road is black. But even the road would get lighter as it moves up because even a black road reflects some amount of that light and, you know, ends up looking kind of grayish instead of blackish. And I want that line down the middle of the road to stay light, like it's either white or yellow. So it's like I'm going to shade the gaps between. I've kind of gone around those dash marks. Yeah, so something like that. So you see how that hill gets darker as it comes down. And even the road gets darker as it comes down the hill towards us, right? Away from the sunlight. The other hill is exactly the same. We're going to start, we're not going to try to like transition from this dark shadow of the back, you know, the further hill. We're going to have a nice clean line between. And then the top of this hill is going to be nice and light, just like the top of this hill is nice and light. And then it's going to progressively get darker and darker. But this hill is so much closer to us that progression is going to take a much larger amount of space. So in other words, we're not going to see as much of that effect. It's not going to get all the way to like super dark because we don't see the bottom of this hill, right? So the bottom of it's going to be a little bit darker, but not much. And then, of course, the road area needs to be much, much darker because it's a black road. Okay, so that's, what about this distant part of the middle ground? It's really still not background. We're going to do a couple of mountains way far away. And the answer is with this whole area, we're just, you know, this is just going to be sort of, it's sand dunes, so there might be some like bumpiness to this, but we're not going to like be able to make out individual. It's just going to be kind of shaded, a very pale, and have like lighter and darker patches. It's almost like shading an ocean where you've got waves that reflect and then have shadows between the waves. But honestly, I'm just going to kind of smudge that because it's so far away, so you're not even going to be able to see much of that detail. Okay, distant mountains, background mountains. I'm going to draw just some overlapping mountains. Notice that the tallest mountains are in front and then the shorter ones are further behind, right? And so something like that. And then I'm going to shade those exactly the same way as I did like here, except I got to think about how round they are, and so like sunlight is going to be hitting the top left corner of each of these over here. So I'm going to shade the top left corner lightly. Right? But then sunlight is not going to be hitting the other side. This side is going to be much darker. Right? And then it's going to sort of fade in between. It's going to, you know, there's going to be levels, different levels of gray in between. Right? And so, again, here, like this side is going to be in shadow because the sunlight is shining on this, you know, this direction. And then there's going to be layers, levels of gray in between as it moves across. And then the same with this mountain. And there at this point we could add, you know, some cacti or some tumbleweeds or anything like that if we wanted, keeping in mind that as you get things further away, they would get smaller. So like if there's a cactus right here on, you know, the top surface of this canyon, then it's going to be pretty big like this. But even if it's like further away on the surface of the canyon here, I could draw the same cactus would be, see how much smaller it would be, right? Because it's farther away, right? And of course you could draw cacti in lots of different shapes. They don't always have like just two stumpy things. Sometimes they have, you know, something like that going on, right? But the reason I wanted to get those in before I end this video is they would have cast shadows on the ground under them that would move away from the sunlight. We kind of talked about this in the river video, the rivers through the moonlit, rivers through the... So moving away from the sunlight, there'd be a shadow going this way, and then it would have to split like this splits. The shadow would have to split and take on the same shape as the cactus that's casting that shadow. But notice that that shadow moves away from the sunlight. And so this would cast a shadow this way, away from the sunlight. And then this one, the shadow would be coming this direction. And those shadows would be nice and long because the sunlight is pretty low. But notice how those shadows don't quite all go in the same direction. They all angle away from this point, okay? And then a shadow over here is not going to go this way, is it? It would go that way. I'm only shading this one side though, so I don't have to worry about that. But if I did a shadow over here, it would come this direction. Last tiny little tidbit, just because clouds close to the horizon are going to be small. Clouds far away from the horizon, meaning at the top of the page, are going to be bigger. Clouds in the middle are going to be medium-sized. So this one should be bigger than that one. Oops. Let's make it bigger and erase this part here. And I don't have time to add the shading to that, but you get the idea. Well, that's it for today, guys. In this lesson, we learned about how to create a desert. We also learned about how shadows can play a huge role in creating that three-dimensional landscape feel. Next week's landscape is going to be a little different because it's going to be an underwater landscape. Next week, we're going to make a coral reef. I can't wait to see you then.